Every day we walk on the surface of this planet, we tend to think to ourselves that while there are dangers that lurk out there in the form of microorganisms, we typically have responses to them as we understand their growth patterns, how they can be countered, and while yes, things like Clostridium difficile are absolute nightmare fuel considering they horrifically can survive isopropyl alcohol, 200 ethanol, which is the strongest ethanol, antibiotics that will basically take you out if you take them, and heat so high that it can literally cook your body, and that doesn't seem to be able to kill it. At least we know what it is. It's also starting to colonize other people's body, and that's completely a problem. Does understanding what it is provide any comfort in the slightest? Likely not. However, what we tend not to think about so much are life forms existing under our very feet that we don't even know about. In May of 2011, for instance, a tornado would tear through Joplin, Missouri, almost completely destroying the town, or at least 75% of it was damaged and 20% of the buildings were destroyed. After the F5 had concluded, and people began to put the pieces of their life back together, a strange set of symptoms began to crop up for a few individuals. A flesh-eating fungus, due to the power and violence that the tornado had, was released from the ground when the tornado tore into it. From here, it would infect 13 people, and then later, 5 of them would actually meet their end. The ground, largely not thought of all that often concerning, things that live in it, contains a plethora of life forms: bacteria, parasites, fungi, and depending on what sort of biologist you ask if it's life or not, viruses. As you dig deeper into the ground or into frozen soils, you begin to run across life humanity may not even been fully aware of. In another part of the world, for instance, due to the permafrost melting, gigantic viruses 100 feet into the soil and ice have been discovered and revived. Well, revived is a generous term, but you get the idea. Essentially, this virus is ancient by human terms, roughly 34,000 years old. But as you go deeper into the ground, potentially even into the very oceans themselves due to shifting waters and continental drift, we may find even stranger life forms, which brings us to today's topic. As an oil company conducts a very standard operation in the North Sea to bring up the lifeblood that currently keeps the entire planet running, they would strike something that would begin altering the crew when exposed, leaving one man, Kaz, on a survival mission to try to get home to his family. But as the day turns into night, not only are people just becoming giant meat monsters, but the almost seizure-inducing biomass growing around the oil rig appears to have more abilities than just existing and melting people down. So in today's episode, let's discuss the feasibility of the central life form in Still Wakes the Deep, what sort of life forms we can point to support these ideas, and how it's interacting with the human meat suit on a cellular level to create the monsters that we see. Also, we have to discuss the neurological implications because there's so much more happening here than just your standard body horror. So, first and foremost, obviously there are spoilers for this game. There has to be if we're discussing these ideas. I had a lot of fun playing it, and you should definitely support the developers and publishers by going and playing it yourself, and then come back here to listen to my absolute cracked out theory and explanation of its biology based on proteobacteria. Also, if you enjoy this content, please feel free to give it a like, and if you want to subscribe for more content like this in the future, do so. Or hate it. I don't know. Let's get to it. Waking up for your fun-filled day at the oil rig that you're totally not going to get yelled at by your boss and totally not going to get transported to the mainland due to a bar fight that you're running from, you head to the canteen to start your day. As you arrive, an announcement goes overhead. The boss is looking for you, and he wants you in his office now. Beginning your walk there, it's an old oil rig with several issues that's about to have several more issues come about. Heading up to the boss's office, you get chewed out, but you're Scottish, so naturally you have to kind of talk back. It's like written in the coding of your genetics after all. Raise hell, praise Dell. A call comes over the phone as the engineer working on the drill says there's something weird on the readings and you're about to drill into it. As Roanoke tells them to drill through anyways, you have to keep your schedule, as the British say it. I'm not really sure why they say it, schedule. Leaving the office, realizing your days of running are pretty much over, it's now time to face the music and turn yourself in. Heading up to the helipad, as you go aboard, the entire oil rig shakes as it seems to have hit a pocket of gas. A man falls in as you try to help him before the oil rig lurches again, causing you to fall off the platform as well. Here's where you have your first interaction with the entity. What seems to be an unconscious dream of sorts, I guess you could call it, is much more complicated than just that, as we will find. Remembering your past interactions with your wife, and possibly soon to be ex-wife, you wake back up slightly as the men have pulled you out of the water. Somehow you survive the fall down into the frigid waters of the North Sea. Your compatriots who fell earlier, not so lucky. Of course, with that, we will see maybe he was the lucky one to go out earlier rather than later. Coming to, your coworkers need to worry about their own hides, so they left you in a room with a heater on, so hopefully you'll be alive as you're warmed back up. As you get back up, you head outside to find the oil rig is in disrepair. Finding a few coworkers around, everyone is completely alarmed by what's transpiring, but nobody really knows what's going on. Asking if you hit a gas pocket, again, everybody's at a complete loss as to what exactly went down. One man who was in a deep dive chamber is absolutely losing it in there as you help raise him up, but your other coworker doesn't understand why he's still freaking out that much. The bends shouldn't hurt that bad. Also, the bends, if you didn't know, is when nitrogen bubbles form in your bloodstream because you didn't decompress properly. Your boss overhead continues telling everyone that they will get this fixed and not to worry as they will all be back at their workstations soon enough. The issue is, though, something has invaded the oil rig that is absolutely detrimental to humanity, and should it spread, it is an extinction level event. Heading below the oil rig, that's where you see it for the first time. Something has been twisted up with the drill upwards and brought onto the oil rig itself. But what is it? Well, we'll get there, so don't you worry your pretty little head about it. As you dive deeper and deeper into the oil rig to make repairs and right it, since it's been absolutely shreked by whatever you hit, you begin to find evidence that something isn't quite right. Blood smears can be seen in different areas, but no trace of the person. Eventually you do run into another coworker, Finley, as she tells you Gibbo has gone completely insane and then tried to attack her. Moving into the area that he's stuck in, you sort of catch a glimpse of something that tells you to stay away, but also not to leave him. Seemingly, he appears to be human, but as you descend the ladder, you see him above running by. This is the first indicator that your day is about to get a hell of a lot worse. Heading into the accommodation, you hear something attacking Trotz as he says his hand is slipping, as then a meaty yell can be heard as he's overtaken by something on the other side of the door. Concluding tea time with Roy afterwards as he's hiding in the storage area, you then need to head onto the deck to get the power back up. As you leave the area though, and then exit onto the open platform, you run across what's really going on. Several of the workers who are left are all trying to get out of there while something is hunting them. Muir has made his way onto the Connex area, and getting a good look at him, this appears to be what's happening to anyone who actually has been exposed to this organism. Becoming a fleshy mass of several bodies, it appears only his consciousness was barely maintained. However, it is not entirely him either. Clearly, he's been turned into something that is no longer human, but composed of humans. This process would happen several more times to others. Rennick, your boss, Adair, an engineer, Trotz, some random guy, Gibbo, some other guy, and Muir, an engineer. So first things first, before getting into what caused this, we need to take a look and establish at what this process is. Towards the end of your fight for survival, you come across one man, Roper, who highlights the differences between certain individuals. There are those who operate the meat conglomeration, and there are those who just sort of become a part of it, and I believe this is predicated on who survives and who doesn't. Roper, upon finding him, appears to have been speared through the back. As is seen with several of the other creatures at this point and appendages that are projected outwards, they have the ability to pierce through a suit and the skin of an individual and hook into the muscle itself. From here, a melding of the material begins, the human cells and the creature's cells. Roper at first appears just like everyone else until he starts talking to you in a more of a warning and fearful way because he's changing. He tells you to keep Rennick away from him and eventually tells Kaz to get away before he is overtaken, and then tries to add Kaz to the meat pile. Concerning Rennick, Adair, Gibbo, Muir, and Trotz, these five are composed of several coworkers, and their morphology, while having some leftover legs, is no longer human in its most basic form, but we also see something starting to happen to those who are added in. First, in several areas, those that have been glued to the ceilings and walls to become the biomass more or less, have limbs begin to grow well beyond what is normal in proportion, and not just growth internally pushing outwards, but the actual proportion seems to have pushed them beyond their predetermined size, but remain anatomically connected with how they should be. With Rennick, this is the most obvious, as his head in the conglomeration that he's kind of forming has grown to the size of a full man, yet is maintained at least some semblance of a human structure, indicating the cells themselves have begun dividing equally. But even still, consciousness is evidently maintained, although I believe something else probably is happening with that. Moving back to Trotz, Muir, and Adair for a moment, this does highlight that there is a body plan, which is interesting as it's typical to what we would see in the deep ocean. Long spindly legs can be seen coming out of the main biomass, as well as tentacle-like suckers, and I've seen enough of the internet to know that is never a good thing. Actually, they almost appear to be similar to that of a spider crab, which is highly interesting as this would seem to put them in the same vein as potentially having influenced deep-sea life. So let's discuss that for a moment to make this connection. Down in the ocean are absolutely horrific creatures. One such beast that needs to be absolutely exterminated with the utmost ire is going to be the anglerfish. My editor should be putting one up on screen right now, and look at that thing. Not even a face a mother could love. That's why they're down in complete blackness, so they don't have to look at one another or their offspring and know the horrors that they have brought onto this planet. Oh, Roanoke, anglerfish are small, why do you hate them so much? Bro, look at these things. They get up to like 6 feet, or around 2 meters in heathen units. Now, that is the top out, as we typically think they're around 3.3 feet, but even that is too much. Anyways, back to this particular entity in the creatures of the deep. If you take a look at the Japanese spider crab, which is almost equally horrible, you would see the body plan is actually very similar concerning the legs of trots, adair, murre, and rennet. We never see what sort of legs Gibbo is sporting, but this would seemingly indicate that the creatures on the sea floor may have an evolutionary connection to this entity. This establishes that it's probably been down there the whole time, creating these horrific creatures. But then the question becomes, well then, what is the entity? Now, you know this channel is all about speculation, and for this topic, obviously it's going to be no different. We know the oil rig was drilling for just that, oil. We also know the deeper that you go into the soil of Earth, you will encounter some fairly ancient organisms. In this instance, we can actually look to real life to find an explanation for what the oil rig hit. Existing currently in oils, as we typically are pulling it up from the planet, there's a gram-negative bacteria, which means the peptidoglycan layer is quite thin, but this bacteria is known as a proteobacteria, as well as other organisms are known as Euryarchaeota. This bacteria appears as a sort of biofilm that appears to have evolved sometime around 1.5 billion years ago. Now, its presence here doesn't indicate the oil itself is 1.5 billion years old, but to be honest with you, it's kind of a myth that oil comes from dinosaurs. 10 to 20% of the oil in Earth's crust appears to come from living organisms, while 80 to 90% is formed by thermal alteration. Anyhow, this proteobacteria would eventually be called Pseudomonodonta, but is an extremely old form of prokaryotes. Now, exposure to this bacteria, while it is somewhat antibiotic resistant due to its nature of it being gram-negative, your body can still typically handle it, though it does cause inflammation in the intestines, resulting in irritable bowel syndrome, but it can also result in something known as metabolic syndrome, which would possibly fix itself in a few years, or it could be lifelong, and metabolic syndrome is not really good. So it's referenced in-game how those who were exposed to this began to change because they were directly covered in the oil when they started screaming. This indicates that the oil itself had something existing within it that has begun this forced change onto people who got splattered with it. But concerning the more realistic connection, the point is that you do not want to come into contact with proteobacteria, allowing it inside of your body. And this highlights how ancient life can and has existed deep within the soils of Earth and the oil wells that we tap into regularly. And this brings us back around to this life form. I believe it is an ancient form of life that has always been there. It is clearly a colony organism of sorts, but I hesitate to call it a fungus, and instead, I believe it's a bacterial colony of sorts due to some of the examples that we are about to talk about. It's clear this bacteria has had an influence on all life forms within the deep ocean, affecting their body plans but not necessarily destroying them in the process. Upon coming into contact with non-native environment and humanity as a result, it appears to have a passive effect on our species, inducing similar body plans that it has done to deep sea life, which began to cause a person to exhibit alterations to their bodies while still potentially maintaining a form of consciousness. Although, once again, it is entirely possible this is not the case judging by the actions of the individuals and what they decide to do upon becoming altered. So, how might this be happening on a cellular level then? Like, how are they altered? Given that I am speculating this is a type of bacterial colony as opposed to a fungus, this would imply that these are in fact prokaryotes rather than our cells, which are eukaryotic. And of course, the main difference between our cells and prokaryotes is that we have our genetic information encased in a nuclear membrane, and prokaryotes have free-floating DNA and also circular clusters called plasmids, as well as like the nucleoid, which is where its main genetic structure is. But these plasmids are quite interesting. Plasmids are non-essential genes that can alter the resistance of a prokaryote. Plasmids can be transferred through direct physical contact, known as conjugation, or if a cell is lysed, another bacteria can actually pick up plasmids and add it to their resistance. This is actually how I used to categorize antibiotic resistance back in the lab, based on plasmids. It was very fun, very interesting. May go back to the lab at some point in my life, but for now, YouTube works. I also still need to go get my master's in like virology or epidemiology. Doesn't matter. So you might be asking what conjugation is. Basically, the prokaryote will spear another prokaryote, and an exchange of genetic information will actually happen across this bridge. And this will increase the fitness in the environment for this bacteria. This is how colonies form actually between different species of bacteria as well. On a cellular level, bacteria is highly social, so to speak. Now, there is another function that is typically reserved for viruses, but it's not exactly like we don't see it in eukaryotic cells, like the sperm and the egg, for instance. Bacteria, on occasion, if the mood strikes, has been known to invade host cells. This phagocytic event is mediated by the bacteria itself, like its goal is seeking to basically enter this cell. Contacting the surface protein, it will enter the cell and reside within a vacuole. From here, it will evade the immune system by existing within the cell membrane and be protected from immune cells. And then it replicates inside the host cell much like a virus will, and it will release the new versions of itself to infect more cells. Now, one of the things that we do not see typically is this bacteria doing anything associated with alteration to the genome of a host cell. In fact, actually, sometimes they'll just release cytotoxic material inside the cell to degrade the DNA. Bacteria are kind of jackasses, but just using the safety of the cell to replicate is pretty much its prerogative. However, we clearly see that with this bacterial colony pulled up from the oil well, that something is different about it. Given that it seems to have a connection with deep sea life, I would have to go out on a limb and say that this bacteria actually does alter the genome, disseminating its own genetic coding. But how might this be possible? I think it's through the very same function that bacteria shares plasmids, and that's going to be conjugation. Once it has entered the host cell, this ancient bacteria will spear the nucleus of the host cell, injecting its own genetic coding. It may even possess a form of reverse transcriptase in order to encode its genes. Now you may be asking, why would it want to do that? Well then, it's really not any different from any reproduction in general. Its genes are carried on and its survival is assured to the next generation. This coding, again, appears to definitely alter species in the deep sea, and humanity would be no different. This process may be desired for the simple fact that the cell, much like how it will then build HIV that has injected into its coding, may have built prokaryotic structures, or potentially this method exists to create more cells, increasing the available biomass so the bacteria can continue to infect cells to create more of itself. So coming into contact with this bacteria not only would cause the cell to take on new genetic information, but the impact that it has appears to be turning a multicellular organism less into what we know to be ourselves, and more to be like a single-celled organism with a colony tendency. Let me explain that. So let's say like you're hanging out with your friend and you guys go to high-five each other. You do not have to worry about your bodies combining accidentally as skin cells on either side are not just going to attach to each other, binding you together. The cell surface proteins called cell adhesion molecules, or CAMs, allow cells to adhere to one another, but are not going to grab onto some random person and adhere to them. Apart from the immunological catastrophe that would ensue, it allows for all of us to remain as individuals composed of 36 trillion cells. However, a colony is different. They will exist not so much in adherence to one another, but be bound through fluid excreted known as the biofilm, which kind of helps them all stay together, and it also provides protection from the environment. There also is some adherence, as they will like stick together to form clumps and microcolonies by self-recognizing surface structures such as exopolysaccharides or proteins, but the adherence is nowhere near as strong as in a multicellular eukaryotic organism such as ourselves, and this is why you can pick up really heavy weight and then your arm doesn't fall off. Now, with this knowledge that bacteria will do this, we also have to look into what's happening with the host cell. As the person is infected by this bacterial colony, their cells begin to take on prokaryotic traits along with multicellular eukaryotic traits. As opposed to no adherence between cells of different bodies, the bacteria will start forcing the eukaryotic human cell to produce these exopolysaccharides, allowing for the human cell from another body to do the same and then stick together. The fusion of multiple people is now functionally complete through this gained trait. And this is why once speared, you are first immobilized, obviously. However, as you are stuck there, you become more and more entrenched with the colony as eventually you are completely melded into it like an arm stuck to your torso or a leg to your pelvis. There is, however, more to it than just being stuck to this bacterial colony. As seen with those who are stuck to surfaces and into the meat of the bacterial colony itself, it's clear to me mitotic events are also taking place. It's no secret that bacteria can actually grow extremely quickly. The fastest bacteria that we know of is actually Vibrio natrigens. It can double its numbers in less than 10 minutes. So let's say that the colony itself took root at this rate. Typically on a small rig, about 50 to 60 people could be working at any given time. Deep water rigs is around 120 to 160. Allegedly, they use deep water rigs in the North Sea, so let's say there are roughly 140 people on this rig. The average man has around 36 trillion cells, so basically that's 5 quadrillion, 40 trillion human cells. If that number is doubling every 10 minutes due to the influence of this bacteria, we can assume that since he got up that morning and it ends at night, about 12 hours has passed. There are 72 10-minute slices in 12 hours, so 72 times 5.04 quadrillion, but using exponential calculators, and again, I'm no mathematician, so bear with me, that should come out to 23 undecillion, 800 decillion, 737 nonillion, 73 octillion, 663 septillion, 10 sextillion cells. How many equivalent human bodies is that? Well, allegedly, it's like 6.1 septillion bodies. Don't think it's actually that much, and remember, it has to reach deep down into the water, so what we would likely be seeing is really just the very tip of this creature. Essentially, that's if it doubles at this rate exponentially. It may actually be slower, but if everyone was infected at once, this is how it would shake out. So you see, this becomes an issue rapidly. Something that helps support this idea that this proteobacteria may in fact be a vibrio, and vibrio is a proteobacteria, is that bacterial bioluminescence is taxonomically restricted concerning proteobacterias to vibrio. As we can see all over the rig, the material is creating its own light. Given vibrio can divide this quickly and produce light as well, this kind of clues us in to sort of help identify it. Of course, we cannot assume that it will just grow this rapidly and wildly out of control forever, but there is always going to be a limit. But the growth that is seen from this creature is actually unprecedented. Bacteria will typically do this to itself. It will expand rapidly as long as there's nutrients to consume to fuel its growth, but inevitably it will actually strip its environment of all nutrients, leading to its own downfall. Anyhow, we must also assume that the mitotic events seen concerning growth of the body parts is also affected by the same growth patterns, which is why Roanoke, even though he took off in a helicopter, was changed so quickly upon crashing back down onto the platform. Once this takes hold, you begin to change within minutes due to the invasion of your cells by this bacteria as you are overwhelmed and turned into something else. It's likely getting this oil and bacteria subsequently on your skin might make it take a little bit longer, as Roanoke was probably injured severely in the crash. This exposed deeper portions of his body to the actual infection. What is also strange, and we have yet to talk about it, is the neurological implications. One of the things that I notice as this material begins to grow is an increasing effect on the brain. Starting out as visual hallucinations of colors and blobs in the eyes, eventually images begin to form, and towards the end, voices are hallucinated, as well as the movement of materials suggesting telekinetic abilities. At first, these images in the eye are likely the optic nerve itself being affected, more so than just the retina, but as it continues, more of the brain will actually begin to sort of be impacted. What you need to understand is, concerning those who are exposed to the infection, the cells of the human body are kicked into overdrive and driven to enter sustained and lengthy forms of mitosis. A nervous system would actually begin to form within the colony, which is likely atypical for what usually happens, meaning this outcome is brand new. And there's a good reason to believe this. The bottom of the sea, for the most part, is pretty much a barren desert. Not much lives down there, and as a result, the bacteria invading cells would be kept low for the most part. However, coming into contact with a cluster of cells, humans on an oil rig, this created a perfect storm for growth. But in that growth were humans who are highly intelligent. This central nervous system tissue, along with everything else in the proximity everybody would be, allows for a nervous system to begin forming and connecting in the tissue itself, each stemming from one person in different areas. This is supported by the knowledge that Roper had about Roanoke coming for him, despite him just being connected to the tissue. This is because Roanoke was thinking it, and then Roper was picking it up. His body was just beginning to fuse, and he actually was tapping into that nervous system. He became aware of the rest of the crew, likely also, that was stuck inside the tissue. Any pain, memories, problems, regrets, happiness would all be pushed onto one another, as well as their own nervous system as it continued to grow. Essentially, you became part of a network, and you became part of this colony. As a result, a person was still somewhat there, but they are now controlled by this larger nervous system that began to form. So they became a puppet, but they also seem unaware of the influence that is being forced upon them. As they roam around, they don't understand why their coworkers are running from them and not helping them, but as soon as they see anyone, the other nervous system takes over, grabbing them and adding them to the conglomeration. Kaz is noted at one point as saying to a head that's on the wall that his ears are still working. Essentially, this consciousness is kept as a natural part of keeping the brain functional for the processing ability it has to decipher incoming sensory information, but the person is really no longer in control. Some of their initial thoughts and views still remain, however, indicating that the brain is still very much so functional. Adair calls Kaz a coward, insults him as well, and then talks about calling his family on Christmas. Roanoke is angry at Kaz, as pretty much he was the whole time, and then says he's going to rip him apart. Muir is just scared the whole time and talks about getting home to his family, but if they see a person, they are compelled to attack them and end them basically as they are controlled by the newly formed nervous system. So what does this really indicate? I believe it's a perfect storm of a new organism that is highly intelligent, us, and an invasive form of bacteria that increases mitotic division. It's clear to me that this is a very ancient form of prokaryote that actually had its hand in shaping sea life based on the apparent fins that seem to grow all around, as well as some of the phenotypic growth seen on Trotz, Roanoke, Adair, Muir, and pretty much everybody else that's also seen in deep sea life. This would place this as potentially one of the first life forms, which would make sense as to why it's at the bottom of the ocean, such as with extremophiles that surround the hydrothermal vents that are thought to also be some of the first life forms. And lastly, I want to get into more of the neurological implications of this fusion of bacteria and human. Interestingly, these hallucinations that form from being close stand out as something more than just a quirky game mechanic, Because of this hypothesized increased neurological tissue, we can only assume that with it, other specific areas of the brain are also growing in capacity, and one of these are the mirror neurons. It's important to understand that all neurons produce a very minute electromagnetic field of sorts. Thoughts can actually be viewed as electromagnetic representations of neuronal information, and with it, if you can decipher what those waves mean, you could, in a sense, read someone's thoughts. Technologically speaking, we are a ways off from this, but with that said, mirror neurons in our own brain may form a psychic ability designed by nature. However, we are really just trying to replicate that now. I mentioned this in the last video, but essentially how it goes is mirror neurons activation was seen in those who were able to guess a card right that a tester was holding up. You saw this in Ghostbusters at the beginning. How they were able to do this potentially could reside in mirror neurons operating similar to how the tester is operating, thus letting our brains sort of take on that thought without knowing really where it's coming from, which would put it outside of our own consciousness. It's deciphering literal energy emitted by another brain. Basically, no different than a sender and a receiver. Now, this science is still in its infancy, so take that with a grain of salt, but if it does turn out to be true, then this may be how the entity is screwing with everyone, but also how those that are walking around are still connected to this colony, despite they're not, like, literally connected. So the brain is relatively small by comparison to this behemoth, and you could compare it to almost the difference in standing of like Earth's magnetic field versus standing in a magnetar's magnetic field. That being a neutron star with an extremely powerful magnetic field. If you could survive the gravity, you would find the salts being ripped out of you. Anything with even like the most minute amount of polarity would be pulled away from your body by the powerful magnetic field. It would almost be instant, but if you could survive even getting close, you would find your nervous system would have trouble firing as the polarity would be disrupted. Obviously, the magnetic field on Earth is not that strong. The entity is somewhat similar. With the electromagnetic waves created by this forming nervous system, they're not really going to tear you apart, but they are strong enough to begin influencing your brain. This will begin activating memories during your waking period and disrupting the brain's ability to exist. Anyone who's directly attached will have extreme difficulty in communicating, as information from the nervous system is impressed upon their minds, disrupting their own thoughts. As the entity grows and the nervous system tissue becomes more active and connected, the organic magnetic field may grow, and as a result, late into its growth, this is where auditory hallucinations begin to take hold, caused by interference of the entity force-firing areas of the brain, such as the prefrontal cortex and parietal lobes, where memories can be retrieved. We also see this magnetic field is so strong that metal begins orbiting the central entity, where assumedly most of its electromagnetic strength exists. This orbiting metal is doing that, quite literally, because the firing of the neurons are creating this field that is ever-changing, meaning metal doesn't just stick to it, but instead is constantly being moved around, chasing the magnetic field that is moving as well. Concerning your brain, you can see that when you are added to the meat pile, because you didn't hide well enough like I did, images of your past and potentially other memories of other people's past flood your brain as it becomes one giant visual hallucination, as you are essentially plugged into the colony to become a part of this nervous system. Basically, you're directly plugged in, so you lose yourself as the meat becomes more connected and larger, and the bioelectric magnetic field that it produces by all the mitotic events inspired by the infection itself begins having an impact on those who are not joining the meat pile yet by force firing their brains just from the simple fact that this thing exists. To round this out, I believe this is a very ancient form of life, simply being an invasive form type of like a proteobacteria, which is a vibrio. This prokaryote would alter the function of the cells, causing them to enter a conglomerate state of mitosis by spearing the nucleus and injecting its own genes. As the person grew and connected to the meat pile, they would then be added, which would then impact others who are not yet combined with it. Had Kaz not blown this thing up, truly being that human intelligence was being added, this could have grown to an extinction level event, or at minimum, would have to be solved with nuclear intervention. You can almost think of it like an organic form of AI using the naturally occurring nervous system of those that it combined with. In fact, actually in the Matrix, believe it or not, for some reason, they had to change it from saying that humans' brains were being used to build the Matrix, because our brains were essentially being used as computers, to the human body was being used as a battery. It was really stupid. The computing one was way better. But with that said, I legitimately want to hear what you guys think. Do you think this is like a homegrown Earth classic or something else? I'm always open to reading what you guys think something is. The developers made a really interesting game, so remember to actually go play it and support them. But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then leaving a like is greatly appreciated, and subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, and Roanoke Tales channel link. But speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. I'd like to thank our 2 astrophysicists, Death's Dancer and Feather. Thank you very much, guys. Next, I'd like to thank our scientists, Argent Sentinel, Dakota 23, Lucian Dragon, Metric System, and Trash Panda in a trench coat. And the rest of my patrons, I greatly appreciate y'all's support. You're absolute ballers, so thank you. But that's gonna do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I'll see y'all in the next one.